So it's Wednesday and the end of a book. You'll be finishing up Ezekiel in your reading today in chapters 46 through 48. This is the 27th book of the Old Testament that you've completed. So again, congratulations, good for you. I'm so happy and proud that you have continued on the journey, whether you've been going from the beginning of the year or you've jumped in at some point, or you're just starting. I'm just glad you're part of this, and pray that the Lord will be using His Word in your life. We'll start tomorrow on the 27th book, and just to give you some perspective, between now and the end of the month, we'll be finishing up 10 new books of the Old Testament. These are minor prophets. Again, the difference between a major and a minor prophet is the length of the work, not the importance of it. So we'll get into several books right at the end here that are at the end of the Old Testament that are very short. And then we'll be moving in, of course, into the New Testament. Will be probably more familiar ground to most of you. So today we'll be finishing up this section on Israel's new worship in chapter 46. And then we move into Israel's new land in chapters 47 and 48 is how this divides up. So I've labeled chapter 46 offerings or offerings continued. We started this in the chapter 45. It was talking about some of the offerings there. The discussion continues. Here we're talking about specifically about regulations concerning Sabbaths and new moon festivals and daily offerings and the regulations around that. And that is the first half actually of chapter 46, goes from verse 1 to verse 15, covers that. Then 15 to 18 are regulations and rules for the prince. And we know that the prince is King David. We know that from Ezekiel chapter 34, verse 24, and Ezekiel 37, verses 24 and 25 identify the prince as David himself. So David will again be part of the worship during the millennial kingdom. And then in verses 19 through the end of the chapter, it discusses places of preparation for these sacrifices and festivals. Chapter 47 then transitions to a discussion of the new land. So again, remember in these last 8 chapters, we're talking about the restoration of Israel. It has discussing a new order, which is about a new temple, new worship, and here a new land. And we find out it's really not a new land, but the old land that God has always promised them. God has never turned back on His promise. Deuteronomy chapter 4 says that the condition of their possession of the land was obedience to the Mosaic law. But the fact that they owned the land never changed. They just didn't have residence in it. So what we see first in chapter 47, in verses 1 through 12, is a description of life in the land. Several have raised objections about the river that starts as a trickle flowing out of the temple and continues. But as I'll point out here, there's every reason to take this literally. No reason to spiritualize this. First of all, as you read through the first half of the chapter, there's no indication here that this is symbolic in any way. In fact, if you go down to verses 10 and 11, it's got some details, I think, that take this beyond symbolism to this is exactly what's going to happen. This is what Ezekiel's seeing, and this is what's going to happen. This reference to fishermen standing by the sea, swamps and marshes being turned into fresh water in verses 10 and 11. I think these are all indicative of the fact that this is literally going to happen, and it's providing some very literal details here. In addition, Ezekiel is not the only prophet that talks about a river flowing out of Jerusalem during the last days. Joel talks about this in Joel 3:18, and Zechariah also talks about this river in Zechariah 14:8. So there's plenty of other prophets seeing the same things and that we see in chapter 47, verses 1 through 12. Then beginning in 13, we go from life in the land to 13 through 23 is the boundaries of the land. And again, this is the land that God has promised to give his people. The fact that they possess the land has never been in doubt from Genesis 12:7. They're the owners, but not necessarily the possessors. And here we see that they will finally possess the land that God had promised to them and enjoy the blessings that are associated with owning the land that Deuteronomy chapter 28 enumerates. It's interesting, down in verse 20, let's say 21, it says, "You shall divide this land among you according to the tribes of Israel." But then there's provision made. "You shall allot it as an inheritance for yourself and for the sojourners who reside among you and have had children among you." Well, the sojourners here are not just anybody. In ancient Israel, they had different categories of immigrants. This particular category of immigrant is a ger. That sojourner translates the Hebrew word ger. A ger, we would think of that as a resident alien of the United States would be a ger. Somebody who has migrated to the United States, has fully embraced our culture, and has essentially rights as a citizen. This is what a ger was in Israel. That these were people who have come to Israel. They have joined themselves to the people of God. They are fully embraced their practices and their beliefs. And they have the rights essentially as citizens. So God makes provision for such ger or sojourners here in the allocation of the land as well. Again, I think it's a detail that indicates that this is literal, that this is going to be a literal division of the land. And this detail about including foreigners, ger, sojourners in the ESV, indicates the level of detail that God is concerned about. Finally, we see the division of the land in the last chapter, chapter 48. The allocation goes from north to south. So it begins with the tribe of Dan in the farthest north and then moves to Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh in verse 5, Ephraim also in verse 5 and 6, and Judah in verse 7. So those are the northern areas north of north of Jerusalem that'll be allocated to the 12 tribes. And then the area around Jerusalem, we've seen this already in chapter 45, it's allocated to the prince, and then two divisions of Levites, the servants of the temple, the priests, and the Zedekites, the priests, the ministers in the temple itself. So verses 8 to 22 cover this central portion around Jerusalem, being allocated to the prince, David, the Levites, both the servants of the temple and the priests in the temple. And then it resumes the allocation of the land in the southern tribes. So we see first Benjamin, then Simeon, then in verse 25 Issachar, Zebulun in verse 26, and Gad in 27. Finally, beginning in verse 30, we see the gates of the city described, and finally in verse 35, the book ends with a very optimistic, hopeful, something I believe that we should all be looking forward to. The Lord is there. The Lord will be in Israel. He'll be in Jerusalem. He'll be in the temple. He'll be reigning and ruling from David's throne in David's presence among not only the 12 tribes of Israel, but over all the nations of the earth. And this is the hope that we all share, Jew and Gentile, all Christians are hoping in the coming of the Messiah. As we close this out, I know there's been a lot of detail in the last chapters of this book, and I just want to remind you that the purpose of the detail, number one, is to, I think, prepare us for this literal fulfillment that's coming, but also to emphasize the fact of holiness, of being set apart for God, both the things that he uses, the place that he's at, and the people that come to him are holy. They are set apart. And all these intricate regulations and rules and measurements identify these things as belonging to God, set apart for him for no other purpose than to serve him and to love him. And brothers and sisters, that's the mission that we have, is with all our heart, with all our mind, emotion, and will, to focus ourselves on the Lord, to set ourselves apart for him, and to be holy, be his holy people. We're going to see that tomorrow when we move into the book of Daniel. That Daniel and his companions, although exiled from the land in the 605 BC exile, they are setting themselves apart for God by their observation of his food regulations. So again, all these rules and regulations serve to set God's people apart, serve to set God's land apart, serve to set God's place apart. And brothers and sisters, it serves to set you and I apart. So let's be set apart people and dedicated to the Lord. So God bless you in your reading. Enjoy the book of Ezekiel, and we'll move into Daniel tomorrow.